Hey, I'm Adam,
I'm Dave.
and you're listening to Fiction.
Or nonfiction. Fiction or nonfiction.
Hey, so this is Fiction or Nonfiction, the show where we talk about viral news stories, urban legends, big stories in the media, and we determine if they're true or not. We use our mighty, mushy brains, and we try to figure out if they're scary because they're true or they're scary because they're just plain old made up. Or sometimes they're not scary stories.
Sometimes they're so scary we can't even talk about it.
So that's it for this episode then.
All
Bye.
right, see you later.
No, Dave, sit down. I've promised you an episode for a while now.
You have?
Because for a while, when we've been recording this season, you've said, oh, I thought we were doing an episode about monsters.
I have said that?
You've said it multiple instances. I have audio evidence of it. I'll play it back to you later.
Okay.
And I know you've really wanted a monster episode. So I figured, why not go big or go home? I'm going to do the penultimate monster episode for you today.
Oh, we're doing one about Godzilla.
Well, okay, not the king of the monsters.
Oh, okay.
The penultimate one.
Okay.
One of the most famous monsters in the entire world, and we're going to talk about whether this monster exists or not.
Oh, is it Nessie?
It's the Loch Ness Monster.
Awesome.
Oh, Dave. So before we get into describing too much about Nessie, just for our listenership who maybe are not aware of what we're talking about, Nessie is not our sweet old elderly neighbor down the street. No, Nessie is the Loch Ness Monster. This is a creature said to inhabit the Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands, and it's often described as being a large, long-necked creature, some even saying it might be a surviving aquatic lizard from a prehistoric era, a type of dinosaur called a plesiosaur. Now, this is very fitting, and the reason I decided to do this episode was because there is a new study being conducted to hunt for the monster.
Yes, I saw that.
I got this from BBC News. It says the largest search for the Loch Ness Monster in 50 years has taken place in late August. The search, which took place from August 26th to 27th, featured the use of drones, infrared cameras, and a hydrophone to detect unusual water sounds. It just took place, so we're not getting any definitive results back yet, but there's already been numerous studies that have taken place. I do want to mention that this study was conducted by the Loch Ness Center and a volunteer research team called the Loch Ness Exploration Group. This is the biggest search for the monster since the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau studied the loch in 1972. So, with all that preamble out of the way, let's talk about our personal beliefs. Do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster?
Well, maybe.
I love your gray answers.
You tell me.
Oh, no.
I don't know. It's one of those things people always talk about. I've never been to Scotland, so I don't know. I haven't been there to investigate myself. I've seen only blurry photographic evidence. It's honestly, I feel it's similar to the Bigfoot myth.
It is. Now, Bigfoot's interesting because there's reported sightings throughout North America. I mean, Loch Ness Monster is just pinpointed within this one geographical area of
Yes.
Loch Ness. But these reports of seeing some sort of monster in this area go back a long, long time. For example, in 1852, there was a report that villagers had seen some sort of creature in the water of Loch Ness, and they brought out pitchforks and various implements to do battle with a sea serpent.
Oh, no.
It turned out it was just a pony taking a bath.
How do you know that?
That was an actual report.
Poor pony.
It's okay. I don't think they punctured the pony. I
Okay.
hope not. But let's talk a little bit about the earliest eyewitness sighting, because when we talk about if the Loch Ness Monster exists or not, what most people report is eyewitness sightings. And those of ponies and of other things that are harder to explain.
Let's hope they were kind to the pony, because the 1800s, they might not have had restraint.
No, well, honestly, in 1852, if they saw a pony, it may have ended up as a steak. But with that said,
Whoa.
what do you think the earliest sighting of the monster was?
Well, you just told me.
No, that's not the earliest.
Oh, it's not?
No.
So I would say maybe even before that, in like the 17 or 1600s.
You'll be surprised. It goes back to the 6th century AD.
Whoa.
So the earliest reported sighting was in this book compiled called The Life of St. Columba. According to the text, St. Columba was this monk who drove away a water beast that was mauling local residents who dared near go to the loch. In order to do this, I love this part of the story, Columba sent a follower to swim across the river, and when the beast appeared to attack the swimmer, Columba made the sign of the cross and said, "Go no further. Do not touch the man. Go back at once." The creature apparently stopped as if it had been, quote, pulled back with ropes, end quote, and fled. In fact, I actually have an artist rendering of the event itself for you, Dave. Too bad this is not a visual medium, but...
Wow. This doesn't look that great.
Can you describe what you're seeing here in the image?
Well, it looks like a man screaming in the water as a dinosaur approaches. And then clearly the monk with a cross on a stick.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, the Loch Ness Monster doesn't look like I thought it would. It looks like just maybe a giant snake or something. And the way it's looking at me is really quite unnerving.
It's a very come hither look, I know.
I don't like it. I'm going to turn it over.
But that is the earliest recorded sighting of any sort of creature or monster in the loch. I do want to say that these sort of reports or stories about sea monsters and bodies of water, they were very common in old medieval tales, and a lot of skeptics of the story say that this very likely just recycles a motif of these stories and just attaches it to a local landmark, in this case, Loch Ness. So, again, the other thing about ancient history when it comes to these sort of reportings is that ancient history has a tendency for embellishment, so we don't know the truth of how accurate this is.
What year did you say this was?
Now, it doesn't give an exact year. It does say the 6th century AD, but this was published in a book about the life of Columba significantly later.
Okay.
So we'll say this. There's a basis for something had happened in the water. We don't know exactly what. Again, ancient history tends towards embellishment, but something occurred.
Maybe it was a giant, sea serpent.
We're going to get into some other explanations of what this thing could be.
Do you have more drawings?
Oh, I have plenty of illustrated evidence for you.
I wasn't expecting this. Please continue.
You're welcome. I'm glad I could give you this privilege today. So we're going to go to a more modern report because in the interim between that 6th century and the Common Era, in particular, let's just refer to like the 20th century as like more contemporary sightings. There were still dozens of reports of seeing something in the water. But an article that attracted a great deal of attention about the creature was published on the 2nd of May in 1933 in a paper called the Inverness Courier. The article was written by Alex Campbell, who was a water bailiff at the loch, and he discussed a sighting made by someone else, an individual named Aldie McKay, and this person reported an enormous creature with the body of a whale rolling in the water in the loch while she and her husband were driving on the A82.
Maybe it was a whale.
Well, I don't know if they would thrive too well in the loch.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But again, this is eyewitness testimony. Now, modern interest in the monster really peaked this year because in addition to this report, just about 2 months later, in a July 22nd article, there was a spotting of something by someone named George Spicer and his wife. They saw an extraordinary form of an animal cross the road in front of their car. This is where I think the descriptions of the Loch Ness Monster really start coalescing into something a little bit more uniform. They described the creature as having a large body, about 1.2 meters high and 8 meters long, a long neck, slightly thicker than an elephant's trunk, and as long as 4 meters. He claimed it crossed the road towards the loch 20 meters away, leaving behind a trail of broken undergrowth. He described it as having an animal in its mouth. So this was actually published in the Courier on August 4th, 1933, just a few weeks after the sighting was claimed to have taken place. So yeah, that's probably the first big ticket sighting in the contemporary era, where we see this monster described in the same way that most people refer to it as being this sort of plesiosaur looking creature.
Do you have a drawing of that?
Do I? No,
Okay.
but I'll give you some. I'll give you some more stuff later. But based off of this description, what are your thoughts on this report?
It might have been some other type of animal,
Mm-hmm.
like a very aggressive giraffe or maybe an elephant.
So
But that wouldn't make sense.
those
'cause
Scottish
it's-
elephants, I know.
It's in Scotland. That those animals don't reside there.
That would be just as surprising, I feel.
Yeah.
But let's think about what they said. This person, George Spicer, said he saw it about 20 meters away from the loch. It had an animal in its mouth. It left this damage in its wake. All this undergrowth and debris was left behind it. If you're an investigator and you're scrutinizing the story, what would be one of the first things that you would try to investigate?
Well, you would try to go to the area where this may have occurred,
Mm-hmm.
right, and see if all that stuff was there. Like it said, he destroyed like the plants and stuff. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
So I will say, even though this report triggered a massive amount of public interest in the monster and an uptick in alleged sightings occurred right around this time, investigators went to the area that George Spicer said he saw the creature around, and they couldn't identify any damage to the undergrowth or any sort of visible signs that there was a large animal traversing across this area. So no actual evidence showing that. Maybe he was just mistaken. Maybe he couldn't quite remember the right area because of the trauma of seeing this gigantic creature. Mm-hmm. Who really knows? But in the end, he could not actually give any physical evidence that he saw something.
Did you say his name is Spicer with a B?
Spicer.
Oh, so Spicer. So this story is a little spicy.
It's a little hot. It's a little al caliente.
Okay.
So I think this just shows that when it comes to any sort of eyewitness testimony, we have to take it with a grain of salt. Because we just don't know. You can't provide physical evidence, and people can say anything. What we need is physical evidence, and we do actually have some contributions from people saying that they have physical evidence of the creature in terms of photographs and film.
Yes.
So the first piece of photographic evidence of the Loch Ness Monster was taken by someone named Hugh Gray on the 12th of November, 1933. Now, the photo is a bit blurry, making it difficult to discern what the image displayed, but he said that this was of a large creature that was about 10 meters in length. I'm going to show you the actual photograph itself.
This is very blurry. What the heck, you? You can't even tell what this is. It looks like it was purposely blurred.
Seeing that photo, would you just think right away this is some sort of monster?
Absolutely. No. I would think this is something. It's clearly something in the water.
Mm-hmm.
But what? I don't know because it's so blurry there's no way to tell.
So with that said, there was analysis of the contact positives from the original negative so they could get a bit of a clearer image, and it revealed the image to be that of an otter playing in the water.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that.
So, there we go. The first piece of photographic evidence is debunked, but that's not to say it's all been debunked, because as we go on, there definitely have been very famous photos, including probably the most famous one, the surgeon's photo. This is the famous one that depicts a hump and the neck of the creature protruding from the water. Again, I have a visual representation of it for you, Dave. Let me go through my photographs.
Ah, yes, this one. So wonderful. This one looks like it could be a real thing. This is the famous one where it's a shadowy, it looks like a Loch Ness Monster. It looks like Nessie. But at the same time, what actually is it? It looks like it could just be the tail of some animal.
So I'm glad you said that, because there was a lot of scrutiny about this photo. It certainly, I think, it stoked fires underneath believers, but for a lot of people, the photograph didn't sit well. There is a lot of questions about the ripples in the water of the photo. They were found to fit the size and pattern of small ripples rather than large waves when photographed up close. So a lot of people who would discern scale and size of images in the water based off of that scrutinized the photo right away, saying this is not a large creature, this is a small thing.
Right.
So there's some history behind this photo, which is very fascinating. This photo was claimed to have been taken by Robert Kenneth Wilson, a London gynecologist, and was published in the Daily Mail on April 21st in 1934.
The Daily Mail?
The Daily Mail. I know, so reputable. Well, Wilson refused to have his name associated with the picture. This led to it being known only as the surgeon's photo, and for 60 years the photo was considered the strongest piece of evidence for the monster's existence. Now, down the road, what happened was this photo was discredited with a publication by David S. Martin and Alistair Boyd in a 1999 book called Nessie, The Surgeon's Photograph Exposed.
Okay.
So they explained how this photograph was actually of a toy submarine built by Christian Sperling, the son-in-law of someone named Marmaduke Wetherell. And I just have to say the names of these people are amazing.
What a name.
Well, what did Marmaduke do, that bad dog? Well, actually, Mr. Wetherell had been publicly ridiculed by his employer, the Daily Mail, after he claimed to have found Loch Ness Monster footprints, and they turned out to be a hoax. They were actually footprints left by, you know, those like novelty umbrella stands that are in the shape of like an elephant or a hippopotamus foot?
Yes.
That's what it was.
Ah.
So to get revenge on the Daily Mail, Wetherell perpetuated a hoax with his co-conspirators, including Sperling, his son Ian, and Maurice Chambers. Chambers gave the photographic plates to Wilson, who was the original gynecologist, the quote-unquote surgeon of the surgeon's photo, a friend who enjoyed a good practical joke, and Wilson sold the photos to the Daily Mail. Now, within this publication, the 1999 Truth About This Photograph, there is actually a diagram showing how this was made. I'm going to show you the image of it.
Ah. Interesting. All right. So it was not real.
So some people who are ardent defenders of the photograph say, no, these other people who are claiming it was a fake, it was a hoax, they're just saying this for publicity, for attention, which is kind of ironic considering what the original story is. But they've actually provided proof. They've provided documentation showing that this has been a hoax. As far as I'm concerned, and all evidence points towards, this photograph has been completely discredited. There have been other photographs as well, but they usually end up being hoaxes or misidentification of natural phenomena. There's a 1938 16mm color film that people said was the first filmic evidence, the motion picture evidence of the monster. It was concluded just to be a floating object. And then there was a 1955 photograph by someone named Peter McNabb. It depicted two long black humps in the water. Upon analysis, people said it was just a wave effect, just two waves colliding together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, recently, in 2011, there was a boat captain named Marcus Atkinson, and he photographed a sonar image of a 1.5 meter wide, unidentified object that seemed to be following his boat for 2 minutes. So that's kind of interesting, this large object following a boat. Well, the next year, in April of 2012, a scientist from the National Oceanographic Center said that the image was of an algae bloom or zooplankton, so that's all it was. At this point, there's been no photographic evidence of the monster.
Something I also just wanted to say earlier when you mentioned about the first photo and we said it was published in the Daily Mail, I went, the reason why is because the Daily Mail is kind of known as being like a tabloid.
Exactly. They like sensationalist stories. They don't necessarily do the hard fact-checking that a lot of publications do. So, you know, we do talk about, can you trust the source? How reputable is the source you're getting your information from? I think that's very important to scrutinize.
Yeah, and Daily Mail continues the tradition to this day. But yeah, I just
they ever?
That's why I just wanted to mention that. But you said there hasn't been a picture since the 50s.
Well, there have been still more photographs, but nothing that hasn't been debunked or been able to be explained in some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing to keep in mind when it comes to photographic evidence or film evidence is that you have to be able to say that there's no other explanation for what this thing could be, that it has to be some sort of large creature that's just having its first documentation in this instance. But every instance of photographic quote-unquote evidence produced has always been able to be explained or has been disproven. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a creature. It just means that these cases of evidence have been debunked. There's also been many searches for the monster, and this is again what was the catalyst for this episode, that big search that took place last August. This is after a long history of all these different traditions of searching for the monster in Loch Ness. In fact, Dave, when do you think the earliest recorded instance of a monster hunt took place in the Loch Ness region? What do you think it was?
I'm going to go with seems to be my answer recently, the early 1900s.
Well, can you narrow it down a little bit?
Maybe 1912.
Well, think about those instances.
1930s.
Okay. You know what? I'll just give it to you.
After the first photo.
You know what? I'm going to give it to you
Okay.
because it was actually 1934, so just a year after that. It was by someone named Edward Mountain. Again, these people's names are amazing.
They're quite good.
They're very amazing. So Mr. Mountain financed a search of 20 men with binoculars and cameras. Wow, such technology. And they patrolled around the loch for 5 weeks. The search party found nothing during the expedition. But then came the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau. This was an organization that formed in 1962 to study Loch Ness and search for the monster. In 1967, they received a grant of $20,000 from the World Book Encyclopedia to fund a 2-year program of daylight watches from May to October of the loch. They used sophisticated camera equipment and covered about 80% of the loch's surface. But with that said, what do you think they came back with?
Some blurry images.
Exactly. There was nothing. No evidence of a monster. After this grant ended, the society continued as a privately funded organization up until about 1972 when it disbanded. Now, throughout its history, though, while no evidence of the monster was uncovered, there were still plenty of people advocating that there's got to be something in this loch, and they still searched regardless. So there was this cat. Well, he wasn't a cat. He was a human being. You know what? When we're talking about monsters, I should be very specific here. His name was Robert Rhines, and he did independent expeditions to Loch Ness after he reported seeing a large shape in the loch in 1972. And over 35 years of searching, he just explored the depths of the loch with sophisticated electronic and photographic equipment. You'll appreciate this, mostly by his own design.
He designed his own stuff?
Yeah, like he was an engineer and creator. So during his time performing these independent investigations, he produced multiple enticing photographs. Now, he was never able to produce sufficient evidence to convince the scientific community that the fabled monster existed, but he did have, as I said, some tantalizing photographs, including this one I'm going to show you. Can you describe that to our audience?
It looks like a rock underwater. Is it supposed to be the Loch Ness Monster?
Well, I think the big takeaway is a lot of people say this looks like a large fin.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, maybe it is a fin. Or maybe it's a really large fish.
It could be. And you know what? If it's a fin, that's fantastic, but...
That's fin-tastic.
Thank you. But you know what have fins? What has fins?
Whales?
Well, that and fish.
Fish?
Yeah.
I said fish.
And turtles.
Turtles. Oh, it could be a giant turtle.
It could be.
And that he was able to get the photo because they're not very quick.
I like how you're rationalizing this. But it's just that this doesn't explain anything. As I said, there's many tantalizing photographs showing interesting objects and things in the water, but nothing that actually says or points towards the fact that this is conclusively some sort of ancient lizard or monster in the water.
What if they put, since technology is more advanced now, they could put cameras at different points in the lake and just have them record, and then they could just watch back?
They have done that.
Oh.
And nothing's come up.
Oh.
But even more so, there was a 2003 search of the loch. It was sponsored by the BBC. And this is actually close to what you're talking about. It used 600 sonar beams and satellite tracking. The search resolution was so good, it could identify a small boy in the water. And I mean like a nautical boy, not like a small child.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is like, how big do you think a small boy would be?
I don't know. Like this?
Well, since this is, an audio program, that doesn't really help. Let's say maybe like a meter, close to a meter.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I can identify objects about that size. The scientist involved discovered no animal of any substantial size and admitted that after this search, this is pretty much proof that the Loch Ness Monster was a myth. Because if there was anything exceeding that size or of that size, they would be able to track it using these intricate satellite systems and sonar beams.
So what if it was using its special Loch Ness Monster powers and hiding this whole time?
You're giving people ideas, Dave. Okay, so you know what? That just means we can't see the monster. But is there anything else that would disprove that it's not there or prove that it's there?
Drain the lake. Drain the Loch Ness.
Drain the Ness.
Yeah.
Nah, we're not going to drain the loch, no. But how about a DNA survey? Would that work?
Sure.
Okay. So what do you think that would entail?
Getting samples from the life in the water and the vegetation, maybe?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this took place in 2018.
Oh, that's fairly recent.
Very recent. This DNA survey took place from an international team of researchers, and they came from all over the place, from Copenhagen, from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and they did a DNA survey of the lake. It was in June of 2018. The results were published in 2019, and they showed no DNA of large fish such as sharks or sturgeons or catfish in the water. However, what they did notice was a large quantity of eel DNA. So the leader of the study, Professor Neil Gemmell, said that he could not rule out the possibility of eels of extreme size being in the water. Now this is important because they found no evidence of any reptilian DNA sequences in the water. So, it's pretty fair to say there's no giant lizards swimming around in there. The plesiosaura would emit such a range of reptilian DNA from the samples, they would be able to identify it. But in terms of these eels, a lot of people have said there's been misidentification of certain animals in the water, which is actually attributable to people's sightings. And one of these things are large eels, because they have long bodies, they're very slender, they kind of look dinosaur-like in their own way.
They might come up in the water where it would look like maybe the long neck of the monster.
And they could even breach the surface a little bit, almost looking like they have humps, like the two reported humps of the Loch Ness Monster. So that actually is a pretty good explanation. So with that said, there is no DNA evidence this thing exists. Any photographic evidence is debunkable. It's just proven to be disreputable, and eyewitness testimony you can take with a grain of salt, of course. So this all shows that there's no evidence that a monster exists in Loch Ness. Having talked about all this, what are your feelings about the Loch Ness Monster right now?
Well, let's go. Let's go look.
Let's go take a look.
No, I do think it's like a myth, like an urban legend, that people like to hear that story. They like to think that there is this maybe mythical creature floating around or swimming around in the Loch Ness in Scotland. And it's also part of the folklore, I think, of the region. Mm-hmm. And I do believe, now I really should have double-checked my information and brought this with me, but I didn't know we were talking about Nessie today. I do believe there's actually tours where they talk about this.
There are.
Yeah.
It's a huge tourist industry. I mean, when you think about one of the reasons why this myth is perpetuated, it gives a lot of traffic to Loch Ness. There's a lot of sales made in Loch Ness Monster paraphernalia. Mm-hmm. There are boat tours. There's films that are filmed on site around the loch. There's a lot of reasons for the locals to want to retain the story and keep it going. But with that said, there's kind of, I guess you can say, a motivation for people to perpetuate this myth. Does anything actually say that there cannot be a Loch Ness Monster roaming around within this body of water? For me, I always like to veer on the side of caution myself. I'd like to say, even though this does not show there's evidence for something, does it say that it's impossible for something to exist in the water? I think what we've discussed so far doesn't. But some people have argued that there is evidence against the possibility of something this large living in the loch. That's what I'm going to talk about right now.
Because of the size of the loch?
Well, that's certainly possible, and that's certainly part of it, I should say. I'm going to talk about an article that was written by a paleontologist and geologist named David Prothero. Now, he offered an explanation to Vox.com about how it's impossible for a plesiosaur to live in the loch. There's a couple things that he brings up. First off, they have not discovered any plesiosaur fossils or bones around the loch. Ever since the 1970s, scientists have dredged and explored the floor of Loch Ness for fossils, and the flat floor of the lake would be ideal for finding bones, but no one has discovered them, and sonar scans of the lake have also failed to turn up any fossils. So there's no fossil evidence showing a pre-existence of these beings within the water.
So you're saying that it's still alive?
Well, here's where it gets very juicy. He also says if there was a Loch Ness Monster, whether it's a plesiosaur or something else, it would need to have an entire population of creatures so they could reproduce in order to substantiate all these claims that have taken place for centuries.
Right.
Well, no one has ever produced any evidence of a herd of monsters, nor are there even rumors or hoaxes to this effect, so there's nothing indicating that there would be a population to sustain this animal. But most important, Loch Ness is too small for a plesiosaur or a similar-sized creature, and you were even talking about this. So researchers with the Loch Ness and Morar project say that there is only about 22 tons of fish in this lake. That's not enough food for a creature of this size to sustain itself.
So what you're saying is the Loch Ness Monster
Gets takeout, yes.
is small.
It's just a minnow. That's all it is. And there's other things going on too. Like, this is the beauty about Prothero talking about this, because not only is he a paleontologist, he's also a geologist. So he knows about the history of creatures and the history of the landscape.
And rocks.
And, well, rocks being part of it. Not too long ago, Loch Ness was covered by ice. So he said that it was about 1,800 years ago when Loch Ness was completely covered in ice. And according to theory, I'm going to restate that because I think I said 1,800 years ago. It's 18,000 years ago that it was covered in ice. But anyway, Loch Ness was completely covered in ice as recently as 1,800 years ago. So people say in theory Nessie could have originated in the Atlantic Ocean and then moved into Loch Ness sometime within the past 20,000 years. But because of the sea levels, because of the coldness of the water melting, Nessie would have to swim against the current through extremely cold water to get to the lake. There's no possible routes for anything to actually get into the River Ness from that ice melting. And because of the low temperature of the water, a creature like this would not be able to survive it. Not to mention that apparently there is a difference of elevation in these underwater tunnels. And this is the thing a lot of people talk about when they argue for the Loch Ness Monster, that there are these underwater tunnels that possibly the creature could be hiding in, and that's why people haven't found it. The elevation differences would actually make it inhospitable for this creature. Basically, when you look at most aquatic creatures, they'll exist within a certain range of elevation in the water, because the water pressure, as you get deeper and deeper, increases, and so they actually can't survive any higher. They'll either implode or disintegrate. So, yeah, because of the deviation of that, an animal this size just would not be able to exist.
Okay.
So, I think this does prove not only has all the quote-unquote evidence been debunked, but there really is evidence showing that it's impossible for a creature of this size to exist within the loch. So, what do you think, Dave, about the reported sightings, the photographs? Like, what do you attribute to these?
I don't know. I think it's a combination of the stories that have been continually told, maybe a little bit of paranoia, maybe not being able to identify exactly what they're seeing, that sort of thing.
Remember our episode we did on Texas Road?
Yes.
When we talked about how there's a phenomenon where people look at an object or in a landscape and they will look for shapes, or their brain will fill in the gaps. So maybe there'll be a tree that is passing by their car window quickly, but in order for the brain to fill in a gap, because of the shape of a tree, the brain will make it seem as if they just saw a person at the side of the car. I think it's very similar for this, that people will look in the water and they'll see a shape Maybe it's a bird, maybe it's an eel, maybe it's a piece of debris, or it's just a wave effect. But their brain fills in the gap that they saw something. And let's face it, there's also the influence of all these stories of a Loch Ness Monster. So if they see something that they can't identify, what's the first thing that they're going to attribute to it?
Loch Ness Monster.
Loch Ness Monster, exactly. Two more things just to bring up to wrap up the episode is that in addition to this, there's hoaxes, where people have outright just lied and made up stories about the Loch Ness Monster, offering false evidence. We did bring up the surgeon's photo, but there was another very famous case that took place relatively recently, in 2004. Did you hear about this?
I did not.
So, in 2004, 5TV operated an animatronic plesiosaur in the water. They did this as part of a documentary about the Loch Ness Monster, but they also wanted to see, would they be able to elicit responses? And they did. They elicited 600 reported sightings.
Wow. Just to mess with people.
Just to mess with people. I do have to say, there is something interesting here. There's been this sudden increase of sightings, particular sightings of this plesiosaur-shaped monster as of the early 1900s, early 20th century, around 1933, when George Spicer saw that creature. Why do you think we suddenly had this influx of images of this sort of dinosaur-like creature in the loch at that point?
I don't know. Are people learning more about dinosaurs then, or?
Certainly, and you're a bit of a film buff. At least I like to think of you as one. There was a very famous film that came out in 1933 that definitely drew people's attention towards dinosaurs.
What year did you say?
1933.
Don't you mean 1993?
Nope.
Jurassic Park.
Well, not Jurassic Park, no. I'm sure that
That was
increased
not
some Loch Ness Monster sightings, too.
Actually, I think that was earlier. No, 1933, a movie?
Mm-hmm.
Is it like Dracula?
Well, with something that's dinosaur-like in it.
Oh, dinosaur-like.
That's not nice to Bela Lugosi.
The Dracula dinosaur. No, I don't. It's slipping my mind.
I'm going to show you an image, a still from the film.
Oh, King Kong.
Describe for people the photograph that I handed you.
It's some sort of dinosaur-like creature coming out of the water.
So in 1933, the feature film King Kong was released. This movie featured a famous scene of a long-necked dinosaur emerging from a body of water. Shortly after, we had the first modern Loch Ness Monster sightings. Now, before the modern era sightings, there were all sorts of different types of descriptions of the monster, ranging from a sea serpent to a whale-bodied creature to a kelpie. A kelpie being a kind of like serpent horse creature that's part of mythology. With that said, though, everything became unified, having these dinosaur-like creatures being sighted after King Kong was released. So, to me, this is just evidence that the early testimonials were influenced by images from this movie. And that's why we continue to see these descriptions, because this was so popular. It kind of unified the type of sightings people were claiming at the time, and that's why we still have, to this day, people making claims or reporting some sort of dinosaur-like creature existing in the loch.
So you're saying it's all King Kong's fault?
So with that said, Dave, there's no evidence that the Loch Ness Monster exists. There is evidence, though, that Loch Ness certainly benefits from it. They pull in a lot of money every year, apparently 25 million euros to the local economy annually.
Wow.
But with that said, scientific studies have proven that there's no such thing as the Loch Ness Monster inhabiting the lake, that there's no possibility a creature of this size could exist within this body of water. That said, the Loch Ness Monster is fiction.
But the story lives on.
It certainly does. In fact, if you want to find out more about the story, you can go to windsorpubliclibrary.com. We have a lot of books detailing the history of hoaxes and certain myths. And you can go to our online resources where we actually have some interesting articles about the Loch Ness Monster. In addition to that, we have The Beast of Loch Ness by Lauren Tarshis. This actually talks a lot about the history of various sightings and hoaxes of the reported monster in the loch. And there's also The Loch Ness Monster, Anatomy of a Hoax by Stephen James O'Meara. That details the surgeon's photo story and other hoaxes that took place at Loch Ness.
And also, I don't know which season it is, but I believe we do have The Simpsons on DVD, and there's that one episode with the Loch Ness Monster.
I never saw that one.
Okay. Well, I don't know which episode it is, but there's one out there. Like, perhaps.
It
Loch
probably
Ness
will. I mean, The Simpsons will never end. Just by the law of averages, there will be a Loch Ness episode. I do want to say, though, this is a bittersweet episode for me because I do feel satisfied knowing there's pretty definitive evidence showing that there's nothing like a Loch Ness monster existing within these waters. But I don't want it to be true. I mean, I don't want it to be not true. I want there to be a monster. I love the idea of some gigantic ancient creature just swimming around those waters. That speaks to me, but with that said, the facts just don't speak to that. And I think when we're doing this type of research, we have to set aside our personal biases, our desires, and our emotions and just embrace the facts. With that said, Dave, do you have any factoids?
I didn't bring any.
Do you have anything about Loch Ness or Scotland?
No.
Have you ever had haggis?
Yes.
I feel so bad for you.
It's like, tastes like hamburger, but it's like not.
Well, that is a horrifying description if I've ever heard one. Folks, if you want us to talk about any other monster sightings or news stories, you can actually contribute a question to the show.
So you can do that by contacting Ask a Librarian at windsorpubliclibrary.com. Put fiction or nonfiction in the title. Tell us your Loch Ness Monster stories. Tell us your haggis stories. Whatever you want. Or tell us something you want to be covered on the episode, and we will look into it.
That's right. There's a lot of big monsters that we can look at later on in the series. Certainly, there's no end to them. But I liked this episode because we were able to pretty definitively uncover whether this monster was true or not, if it exists or not. I think for a lot of these cryptid sightings, we just don't have the evidence to fully debunk them, but I'm pretty confident with what we've come up with on this episode that we proved the Loch Ness Monster is just a story.
With that said, this has been
Fiction
or nonfiction.
Tune in next time.